Hi friends, I hope you've been well, but I'm very excited for this video or this series to start, but I'm finally ready to share with you how I dye yarn. So yeah, we're gonna start with that today. It's very exciting. My cat is on my lap. She decided to lay down the second I set up the camera, so hopefully I don't get too distracted. Although, if I talk long enough, she may want to leave, and she's getting up now. Okay, goodbye. It's been nice. Come back. Of course. So, dyeing yarn. There are so many fun things about dyeing yarn. There are also lots of very stressful things. Unfortunately, today we are going to go over the things that aren't as fun, but I think are still very important. This video is going to be all about the different equipment and dyeing gear that I use personally and what I've seen other people use. I hope that this helps inspire you or encourage you to start dyeing with what you can. You do not need to have a setup like every other dyer. Most dyers use completely different things to achieve their own unique results. I feel like even if you 100% follow a dyeing video that you see someone else do, you're probably going to get different results just because you're a different person, different environment. So it's really important to experiment and to not give up. Dyeing can be stressful, like I said, but it can be really fun and really beautiful and just a really good hobby to have. It can get expensive, but it does not have to be. You don't have to start with everything. You can start with the bare minimum and make the most beautiful yarn that you've ever seen. First things first, we're going to talk about safety because it is the most important thing, and I don't want anyone to miss out on the fact that acid dyes can definitely be harmful if they are not used properly. Of course, you're not going to eat them on purpose. But when dyeing, when you have an open container of dye, or if you have any dye powder that is not mixed yet or dissolved, you always want to be wearing a respirator or a KN95 mask. I started dyeing with fabric masks, but I don't think that they really protect you enough because the dye particles can sit on there, they can move around more easily, and it's harder to see them, I feel like, in fabric. But please be safe whenever you are handling the powder dyes. Always protect your body because the dyes can get through your nose, you can breathe them in by accident, and they can find their way into your lungs and be pretty harmful. Once the dyes are dissolved in water, if you do all of that ahead of time, you don't have to wear a mask like when pouring the dye mixture or anything like that, but you can always for safety. And if you are going to be speckling with like dye, dry dye powder, also wear a mask for that, please. Aside from that, other safety things can include gloves, different types of gloves. I usually use what I call like dishwashing gloves, the bright yellow ones with like the longer armband. I will use those if I'm going to be like moving the yarn around in a pan and things like that. For speckling, I use latex gloves. I like to reuse them as much as I can. I'll usually like speckle with them and then wash off the dye, pat them dry, and put them aside so that I don't have to throw them out every time. It makes me feel a lot better about using plastic gloves. I would also suggest wearing an apron. As careful as you think you may be, there are always going to be accidents. This is the one that I'm honestly not as good about because I always forget to put my apron on. I've been pretty lucky, but I have ruined a couple shirts, unfortunately. They've become sleeping shirts or just like dyeing shirts because of that. So that's very important. Another thing that you want to have handy that you probably already have at home are just paper towels or washcloths dedicated specifically to dyeing. I think that washcloths are very good for like cleaning up spills and bigger things like that. Paper towels are also great for checking dye color, and we'll get into that in a later video as well, but they have a few different uses that I like to use them for during dyeing. The last thing that I would say for like safety or prep area. If you're going to be dyeing yarn in your kitchen or anywhere near food or family, definitely you'll want to at least cover the area where you're going to set up your dyeing stuff on the counter. I used to, when I did it in the kitchen, I would put down like a square or rectangle of plastic wrap, and then I would only open my dye containers on top of that. Of course, dye can still get other places on the counter or something like that, but I think it can definitely help with cleaning up, making that a lot easier, and prevent as much dye getting anywhere it's not supposed to be as possible. The next small topic that we are going to chat about is utensils. There are a bunch of different things that a lot of dyers use to measure, pour, mix. There are so many different things that you can use for this one. I feel like this one is the most, every dyer has their own unique thing, and it's like always different pretty much that I've seen when other dyers share their process and things like that. To mix the dyes, you'll usually want a measuring cup, measuring spoons, very small ones. I usually use like 1/16 of a teaspoon up to 1 teaspoon, so like very small ones, but of course you can use more if you want more saturated colors and things like that. Let me check my list. Specific spoons to stir with when you mix the yarn, when you mix the dye powder, and then also bigger spoons when you stir them either in pots or in the pans. Some dyers like to use tongs to handle the yarn when it's very hot and like putting it in and out as well. Another thing that I would suggest to help more easily handle the yarn, especially when it's hot, is reusable zip ties. I really like to use these because you don't have to throw them out after each use. The zip ties definitely help you to handle the yarn when it is hot. It also helps prevent tangling, like moving the yarn around in the pot or the pan. I know some dyers like to use plastic like shower hook curtains, or like the circles. So anything kind of like that helps you differentiate between just a random clump of yarn and like, I don't know how to explain it, but grabbing it by that will definitely help prevent tangling because it goes through the yarn. That doesn't make sense, but you'll see what I mean when we get to those videos, so sorry that that's kind of vague, I guess. Another thing you will want for your yarn are specific buckets or bins to soak your yarn in before and after. These can be the same kind of buckets or things that you would use to block your finished knits and things like that. It's just something that holds yarn that you can let the yarn soak in before you go to dye it and when you are rinsing it at the end of your dyeing session. And lastly, I know we talked about spoons to mix dyes with, but there are a lot of other things you can also use if you are trying to mix dyes in your measuring cups or even in your pans. I've seen a lot of dyers use like milk frothers. You can get them really cheap on Amazon. They help to hopefully dissolve all of your dye before you add the yarn to the pot. Some dyers have used like very small whisks. I usually use coffee stirrers. I got metal ones that I don't have to like throw out every time, and I usually use those to hopefully like vigorously shake it up a bit. I do also have a milk frother that I use sometimes for more stubborn dyes, and to also help with more stubborn dyes, I know a lot of other dyes also use this, but you can get an electric kettle. You can find them pretty cheap as well. Just I feel like the hotter the water is, the more dissolved your dyes can be. Some dyes are very stubborn, and even if you think they're fully dissolved, you'll put your yarn in and see all these like micro speckles along the skein, which sometimes look really cool. Sometimes they're very unfortunate. Next we are going to talk about, I messed up where I was. Heat sources. Heat sources. Okay, so one of the main things that you will need for your dyes to actually set in your yarn is a heat source. A A lot of people use stoves. I started out using my stove for a couple years, so that definitely works fine. Just be extra careful that you clean up before and after you dye, so that you don't accidentally get dye in any of your food. That would be no bueno. But now I use electric burners. I know there's a large variety of these. I have a couple different kinds. I have ones with just one burner. When I'm soaking or dyeing yarn in like a big pot, I'll use just the single burner. I have some with double burners when I'm using a longer pan for other techniques, like variegateds and things like that. I know I've seen that people have even used crock pots. So if you get a crock pot, you can use that. I would not use that for food ever again. It would only be a dyeing crock pot. But that would be a pan and a heat source in one, which is pretty convenient. I feel like if you are starting out and want to try that way, I'm sure local thrift stores and things like that you can find like a lot cheaper. All of this equipment really, definitely source like, I feel like the cheapest, most affordable option, especially when starting out, because you don't know if you'll like dyeing enough to actually do it long term, and it just makes sense to try it out and test to see what you like, because a lot of times you'll try with certain, even certain techniques you'll find you don't like. It's all about experimentation. I've also seen some people use those like reusable aluminum pans that you can get in the baking aisles, and put their yarn in the oven. That also works. There's a lot of different things that you can use for this. Some even smaller dyers will use a microwave. You'll have to see their videos for that, because I'm not sure exactly how best to protect the yarn while doing that. I think that I've seen people wrap it in plastic wrap and put it in the microwave, so to be careful not to melt the plastic wrap. So just don't microwave it for too long, I guess. But yeah, there really are so many different options, and you don't have to do the ones that I do or the ones that you've seen other people do. Just do what makes sense for you and what you can fit in your house or apartment, depending on the size and what would work best for you. Next, we're going to talk about dyeing vessels. Mostly for this, we would just want to look for stainless steel pots, pans, and things like that. You don't want any pots or pans that have like a non-stick coating or anything like that that could kind of come off and be absorbed into the yarn. I don't think that ceramic or anything heavy duty would also be great, except for crock pots. I know they're kind of in the league of their own. But for everything else, you mostly just want stainless steel. I have a couple bigger like pots, large pots, small pots, that I will usually use for dyeing tonals, and I have a few roasting pans that I got from a catering website for variegated and like laying yarn out and like doing different techniques that way. But the size and the shape of the pots and pans that you have doesn't necessarily matter. You can get whichever you'd like. Again, I think that thrift stores would be a good place to start to see if there's any that you can reuse from there. And again, everything you use for dyeing, do not ever use for food after that. At all. Don't do it. Even if you think it's super clean, just don't use it for food. Everything you get for dyeing will be for dyeing. Put it away when you're done. Keep it out of the kitchen. Yeah. The next section is probably the most fun, but we're going to talk about the dyes themselves. So everything in these videos that I'll be sharing are all about dyeing animal fiber, natural animal fiber, merino wool, yak, mohair, things like that, can be dyed with acid dyes. Acid dyes are not used for like plant fibers, cotton, bamboo. I'm not familiar with those, so those do have a slightly different setup and dyeing process that I'm not familiar with. So everything that I talk about will be for animals only. And for that we use acid dyes. Yay! There are, I don't know how many companies there are that sell acid dyes. I don't think there's a ton. I feel like there are 3 main ones. There are a couple others I've heard of, but The three that I use are Jacquard, Dharma from Dharma Trading Company, and Pro Chemicals. A lot of dyes are made up of multiple pigments of other colors, so sometimes when you look at the dye in the bottle, it may look nothing like the color it's supposed to be until you mix it in water and everything dissolves together and looks beautiful. So that sometimes is a fun way to experiment with speckling, because when you speckle, it'll break apart to each like pigment that the dye is made of. So sometimes you don't know what you're gonna get with speckling. Sometimes it can ruin colorways when you're experimenting. Sometimes it can make them better. But one of the other things that you definitely need when using acid dyes, aside from water is another thing that you need for all dyeing. I didn't mention that. It's very important. But another thing that you need is an acid to actually activate the dye and help it exhaust on the yarn and like fully set. There are 2 acids that I know of. There may be more, I don't know. I feel like all dyers that I've talked to or like seen online use one of the 2, and I honestly don't know if one is technically better. Like, I don't know if one helps the dye set better or not. I think it's just a personal preference usually. But the 2 acids that you can use are either white vinegar or citric acid. I think you can get both of them from the grocery store. I usually order citric acid online because I usually get a lot of it at once. It makes it easier, and it gets delivered to my door, so I don't have to carry it very far. But for me, I haven't really used vinegar that much. I've used it a little bit when I dyed some stellina yarn because I think citric acid eats at the metallic yarn a little quicker, or so I read. But I'm not really that familiar with like how much to use or anything like that. I chose not to use vinegar before I'd even tried it because of the smell. I didn't want to be around hot vinegar all the time. Your hands get stinky. It's hard to like get rid of the smell. So it's just because I'm a baby, but you can use whichever one you want, whichever one is more accessible to you. I think vinegar is probably a little cheaper overall, but they're both still pretty affordable. But yeah, whichever one you want to use, go for it. Another thing with getting your dye bath to a certain acidity, I know that some dyers also use pH strips to actually check the pH levels of their water. I don't do that. I've never actually done that, and maybe I should have. But I know that different waters, like if you move from one house to another, the water supply could be more or less acidic, so you'd want to compensate with the acid amount that you put in to make up for that. I don't know the exact pH that it's supposed to be overall. Am I even really a good dyer? Probably not. I should know this. But for me, pretty much everything I do, I just use 2 tablespoons of citric acid. If I want a more saturated color, usually I'll use a little bit more. Like if I use a lot more dye in the dye pan, I'll use a little bit more acid to hopefully soak up and absorb all of the dye that I added. But yeah. And lastly, a few things that you probably also already have lying around the house is just some cleaning supplies. When you're done, especially if you are dyeing in your kitchen, you want to make sure you'll wipe everything in the area, even the wall a little bit. You're like, well, I was super careful. How? I didn't splash on the wall. But then you find out like the next day that there's like some dry dye powder that made its way somewhere else in the kitchen. It happens. Sometimes dye has a mind of its own. But I just really want to emphasize that it doesn't hurt to clean up a little extra. I know it's a pain in the butt, especially when you're waiting for your yarn to dry and you just want to use it. Like the last thing you really want to do is clean. But it's very important, especially if you're in a kitchen or inside your apartment. So just like normal cleaning supplies, sponges, dish soap probably as well, for cleaning out your dye pans. Sometimes, especially certain colors like red, very nice, but they're very not nice to your pans. A lot of times dyes will stain your pans. And if you don't clean them properly, the next time you go to dye something, that color will lift off and attach itself to the new yarn where it's not supposed to be. So it is also important to clean your dyeing pans. For a while, I was using rubbing alcohol, which does work, but it's kind of a pain in the butt. You have to use a lot if you have like bigger stains, and it's alcohol, so it like evaporates really fast, so you have to use a lot of it and scrub a lot, and it was a pain in the butt. But I think it was 2 years ago, Taylor from Fiber for the People posted a video about how she cleans her pans, and it has changed my life. And I will probably do another video on this as well, because I do it a little bit differently, but she actually uses and soaks her pans with OxiClean. OxiClean laundry, you guys. It's a life changer, I promise. So whenever you're done with your yarn, I usually just fill the pan a little bit with water. I make sure the water is as high as it was when the dye was in, because sometimes the color will like stain the sides of the pan as well. And then I spray some OxiClean in there and let it sit for a while, and then I will go back and heat up that pan a little bit with no yarn in it, just the OxiClean and the water, and it's magical. It just lifts the dye like right off of the pan. You usually do not have to scrub it afterwards. Sometimes you do with bright reds, of course, but for the most part it just kind of cleans itself, and it's awesome, and you should get it. And also it works great on laundry. I didn't know that until I got it for dye, which obviously. I forgot about one of the most important parts of this process as well, and that's the yarn. Where you source your yarn is pretty much up to you. There are a lot of yarn suppliers and more accessible places that you can get yarn. If you go to Michael's or Joann and get like a bare wool yarn, you can definitely use that from there. Knit Picks has a lot of great bare yarn options that are superwash, so they are a little easier to start with because you don't have to worry about felting them by accident or anything like that. But yeah, you don't have to like wholesale yarn to start with. You can get 1 or 2 skeins and just see how you like it and how it feels, and then go buy more if you'd like, or just stop. So thank you for sitting through all of that. I hope that somewhat made sense, and if it didn't, hopefully it will in the next few videos when I actually go through and use all of the equipment and show you how I use it. I know equipment is not as fun to talk about, but I just wanted to make sure I listed out all of my thoughts on that before we get into actual dyeing, so that that can be more focused on like the dyeing techniques and everything like that. If you have any questions about what I've already mentioned, please leave them in the comments so I can get back to them, or make a or include them in like a follow-up video or anything like that. Hopefully that somewhat made sense if you did watch this whole thing and you are gonna be joining us for actual dyeing in the next few videos. I'm very excited. If you do end up making anything at the end of the series, please tag me so I can know. But I hope this inspired you to think about dyeing if you are interested. I think that it does seem scary at first, but it really shouldn't be. I feel like I had mentioned different hand-dyed yarns to my husband for a couple months, and then every single time he's just like, well, why don't you try it? Why don't you try it? Just try it. And then eventually I did, and 3.5 years later, here we are. But when I first started it, we were in a pretty small apartment, so you really don't need a bunch of space or a bunch of room, just a couple things. And then from there, you just need a little bit of creativity and a lot of patience. If you are going to stay on this journey with us and start dyeing yarn for the first time, I would love it if you tagged me in anything you make from these, but hopefully in the next video we can start dyeing some yarn with all of our equipment and safety measures put in place, of course, and I hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone! Just use like milk frothers. You can get them really cheap on Amazon. They help to hopefully dissolve all of the yarn before you put, aluminum roasting pans with the like lids that you can buy. Next we're going to talk about, I didn't even think of what word I wanted to use. Next up is things we want to dye our yarn inside of. For a lot of what else was I gonna say? I feel like I probably talk too fast. I'm gonna cut this out anyway, so I'm just gonna say